Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Just as people are filing in, I'll say that we'll be starting momentarily. In the meantime, though, please be aware that if you would like closed captioning for the talks, you can find that at the bottom of your screen. There's an option to turn on live captions, live subtitles. Also, the chat function on today's call is disabled. However, there is the option to submit questions for our panelists. There's a Q&A link also at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to use that during everybody's presentations or afterwards. And once again, in a minute or two, we'll be starting the official program. Thanks, everyone. Hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's program. My name is David Shivitz. I am a professor of Jewish history at Northwestern University and director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies. And I'm really delighted to welcome everyone to the fourth session of our five-part series, Arab Jewish Culture, Identity, and Language, Past and Present. So far, we've had three really terrific events, and today's promises to be no different. I'll also just let everybody know that 2 weeks from today, on Sunday, June 13th, also at 11, we'll have our fifth and final session in this series. Each of these events is freestanding, so people should feel free to join just for today or just for next week without feeling like they need to come to all of them. That event next week is going to feature a performance and conversation with the Israeli singer and composer Ziv Yecheskel, and I think that'll be a terrific event as well, so please mark your calendars. In general, you can find information about upcoming programs, as well as recordings of past programs that we've put on at our website. That's going to be dropped into the chat. It's Jewish Israel Studies Center.northwestern.edu. So find that address. And you can also have the option there to sign up for our mailing list, to find us on social media, and to learn more about what we do. Today's event, Arab Jewish Intersecting Identities, Gender, Protest, and Politics, features three really all-star presenters who are going to share their knowledge and experience with us. And the conversation is going to be moderated by Professor Shir Alon, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. She works on modern Arabic and Hebrew cultures, and her publications have appeared in a wide array of different academic journals. She's currently working on a book that focuses on the present as a narrative problem in modern Hebrew and Arabic literatures. She's going to be introducing each of our speakers and moderating some Q&A at the end. Before I turn things over to her, let me just publicly offer my gratitude to Nancy Gelman and Katie Genio, who are the administrative lifeblood of the center, who've helped to make this program possible, and especially to Dr. Maayan Hillel, who's a postdoctoral fellow in Israel Studies at the Crown Center at Northwestern, and who is this whole series has been her brainchild, and she's put an immense amount of effort and hard work into making this a reality. And we're so grateful to her. For those of you who are still on at the end of our event, she's going to jump on to preview our final series event, which is going to happen 2 weeks from today. So let me now turn things over to Professor Shir Alon.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for coming to this fourth session. I want to thank Maayan and the Crown Center for organizing this truly important series of events and conversations that perhaps unfortunately gained increased urgency in the past few weeks. And I just want to say that I'm truly honored to be able to chair this panel of three stellar, incredible scholars and thinkers. Our speakers today will be Henrietta Han Kalev from Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, Orit Vaknin-Yakutieli from Ben-Gurion University, and Hiba Nabil Iskandarini from the School of Built Environment at Birmingham City University. It's a very packed program that we have this morning, so I will go on to introduce and hand it over to our first speaker. Henrietta Han Kalev is a political scientist and gender studies scholar. She is Professor Emerita of the Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, Israel, and founder of and first chair of the Gender Studies program at Ben-Gurion University. Her recent publications are Women in the Wilderness and An Anatomy of Feminist Resistance, and she is the author and editor of multiple publications on Israeli political culture. In 2000, she was awarded by the Jewish American Congress and the Women's Lobby for Women who made a difference and change. And in 2004, she served at the Nobel Prize Committee for the election of women candidates from the Middle East. Han Kalev divides her time between academic and human rights activities, and I know she has made a difference in the life of countless young scholars. Today, she will talk about the history of the Mizrahi protest, a chronicle, review, and lessons.
Thank you very much, Shio, and good morning and good evening to those of you who are in their morning or their evening. I have only 15 minutes, so I'm going to condense a brief history of Mizrahi protest, a chronicle review actually, look at the 5 cycles of demonstrations and protests. And if I have time remain, I will address a couple of insights and understanding of how this had the impact on the Israeli life. So I go ahead. I begin by a quote as follows. Such an aliyah we have never seen before, wrote in panic in 1949 the reporter Aryeh Gelblum after he spent a month in Sha'ar Aliyah with the immigrants from Arab and Muslim countries. It took another 10 years for the immigrants, already called inclusively the Mizrahim, although they came from various countries in the Middle East, then they have been called in general as Orientals. They burst with riots in the Arab neighborhood where they were sent to live in Wadi Salib in 1959, protesting against the establishment, neglect, and the discrimination against them. The establishment panicked and they used violent means to put an end to the riots. In the media, it was reported that the Judge Starkman stated that he who will mention his Moroccan origin will be punished twice. The leader, David Ben Arosh, demanded to run for the Knesset election, but instead he was imprisoned and denied his right to run for the Knesset. Another 12 years elapsed. In 1971, a second generation of Mizrahim grew up in poverty and crime, and burst out again as in demonstrations on the streets of Jerusalem. Again, they came from an Arab neighborhood called Musrara. When I say Arab neighborhood, I mean that before the establishment of the state, Arab citizens, Arab inhabitants lived in these neighborhoods. And in Musrara, the Jewish immigrants from Arab and Muslim countries were put to begin their lives as olim. Their inspiration and name were taken from the Black Panthers movement. They called themselves the Black Panthers, and ideologically, they also held perceptions of the new left. The ideas of made Aliyah with a USA immigrant, Dr. Nomi Keys, an activist from Berkeley, California, who accompanied the youngsters' protests. This time, it was Prime Minister Golda Meir and Teddy Kollek, the mayor of Jerusalem, who denied the discrimination and used all means to oppress the rights of expression and gathering of these youngster protests. 12 years go by. In 1984, the third significant rebel of Mizrahim burst out. This time, from the heart of the political system, a party is born called Shas, the Mizrahi segment of ultra-Orthodox party Agudat Israel, that organized as a political movement from within the political parties. It proved this time that without the Mizrahim Orthodox political segment, the Ashkenazi parties were less than half their force in the parliamentary coalition, the democratic system of the Israeli regime. From the right or the left, people came together in order to protest against their discrimination within this new party, Shas. Since then, the population of the parties of the ultra-Orthodox split and never recovered again. They never recovered their power again. There is this song in Hebrew of Einstein and Uri Zohar that describes the way that a convoy still goes on. It's called Venimshechet Shayara. And again, the convoy goes on. Another 12 years elapsed. It is now 1995. The state of Israel exists already 47 years already, and the discrimination goes on against the Mizrahim and deepen, turning them into a population that lives in the margins, in slums, with high rate of crime and neglect. The next protest emerged from around the corner right after the assassination of Rabin in 95. A handful of Mizrahi intellectuals who made it to the universities formed in 1995 a movement called Democratic Mizrahi Rainbow. They reviewed policy documentations, this time more scholarly, educational decisions. They reviewed statistics of employment and unemployment, housing or lack of housing of Mizrahim, and published how the melting pot policy, in fact, erased Mizrahi legacy and history, and how they were pushed to the social, political, and cultural margins. The Orientalist establishment and the racist attitude of the establishment were now exposed in the writing, in the academic sphere by this group of the Mizrahi Rainbow, and showed how the power centers are occupied especially and dominated by Ashkenazim, that is, the people who came from the Western world, either Eastern Europe or Western Europe, or of course the United States. The Mizrahi intellectual pointed to the discrimination boundaries of the state against Mizrahim and stimulated a stormy public debate, placing it next to the Israeli Palestinians. They also appealed to the High Court, demanding the acknowledgement of discrimination against Mizrahim everywhere in every domain of life. They used media, court, and other means to give voice to their struggle. And in the court, they gave a struggle about the allocation of the policy of the allocation of the land policy. They pointed to the kibbutzim as privileged, arguing that they got the better part of economic chunks, better part of land, and even their debts were covered by the government, and as opposed to the Mizrahim, who were, as I say, pushed to the margin and neglect. The first years of the millennium found a divided society with 3 generations of Mizrahim and Ashkenazim. And the social rift, more than 50 years now, was consisting of actually tension and even hatred, deep emotions of rage nourished this relationship. The Jewish nation unity remained and it became an ethos, but just a legend or a myth, and the dream to unify the nation of all Jews from all diaspora actually collapsed and went down. It was Mizrahim of all 3 generations carried on themselves painful humiliation experiences and started to think of their ancestors and how to give the story of their ancestors and tell how the methods of assimilation were aggressive towards them, and they still go on within the educational system, the housing system, etc. A group of young poets calling themselves Ars Poetica organized slum poetry project. There they gave voice to the pain that flow in their veins reported by their ancestors from their being children. The expression ars is used in double meaning in Hebrew. It is a derogatory word meaning a pimp for in Hebrew, but also used as an ars in the sense of poetry. And they started actually criticize the authorities and criticize the situation of being discriminated against through poetry. So actually what we can see here is a process of using all means, all strategies of demonstration in order to tell the history of being discriminated against for more than 60 and now even 70 years of Mizrahim. Before I turn to conclusion, I want to address 2 issues that play an elephant in the room, to play the role of an elephant in the room. First, as the Orientalist establishment discriminated Mizrahim and Arabs, the question is how come both Mizrahim and Arabs abstained from uniting forces and struggle against the denial of their rights. The Mizrahim being denied as Mizrahim because of their culture, and the Arabs, of course, because they were those who remained in Israel, and which became a state surrounded by Arab countries and enemies of Arab countries. There are a few explanations of which I mentioned that in the early years of the state, the Arabs were isolated and were under a military rule for 17 years until 65, 66. Six, it is hard to ignore the idea that this policy was part of divide and rule policy, and it also isolated them from the Mizrahim. On the other hand, the establishment applied all aggressive methods in order to force the Mizrahim to discard their legacies and Arabness, which they held as primitive and retarded, as I think everybody knows. To this attitude, the Mizrahim often, surprisingly or not, responded with a desire to be accepted by the absorbing authorities, the Ashkenazi absorbing authorities, and went through a process which I call Ashkenazification. However, that is forgetting their legacies and trying to assimilate. However, in recent years, the narrative changes, and pain, as I said, humiliation and traumatic memories of shame and regret, together with strong passion to be accepted as equal Israelis with their Arabness, surface to the discourse. But the opportunity to join forces with Arabs is lost ever since. Israeli Arabs understand Israeli Arabs understand that Mizrahim were too weak to be an effective force to join with against their deprivation. Today, both Arab and Mizrahim became two complex groups and too complicated in their ideology, and have diverse interests that I hardly believe in a chance of their being, of their unity. But Mizrahim did shake the political balance in three political turnovers. The most famous is the one when the Labour Party lost power after 33 years of rule in 1977, and the right wing came to power. In 1981, it was Tami, the party that was established by Aharon Abuhatzera and led to a decomposition of Mafdal, a very strong religious Zionist Ashkenazi party dominated all the ultra-Orthodox Zionist population population until 81. In 83, the establishment of Shas, which I already mentioned, brought the decomposition of the ultra-Orthodox, very strong and old party of Agudat Israel. All three parties have never covered. The turnover actually changed from radically the map of the parties in Israel, indicating how strong the Mizrahi factor is dominating the political map and the political decisions. I'm turning now to conclude. When reviewing the protest and rebels' history from a wider perspective, there are a few points that should be highlighted. First and foremost, Mizrahim were never passive and apathetic to their fate, as they are often described in the Orientalist literature. Second, the strategies the Mizrahim used range from violence to poetry, through publicity, going to court, media, introduction in shows and televisions, etc., and so forth. That is, it's all the time present in the consciousness or social consciousness. The Mizrahim moved from more violent, spontaneous and immediate pain expressing strategies to more cultural, artistic means through no less aggressive, using harsh language. From physical violence to political organization, from that to intellectual discourse. Now it is running on social networks and seems to be here to stay. And it's here to stay because the authorities and the society do not show any way to acknowledge and to begin to discuss the deep rifts that Mizrahi Ashkenazi go through. Thus, the issue of Mizrahim became, and this is, I think, the significant conclusion, became an issue without which the Israeli history and society cannot be understood. These chronicles show that process that attest a deep social split became part of the social structure. Beginning with hard time to integrate, the Mizrahim had to write a separate chapter of the history next to the Zionist narrative of the Ashkenazim. This is the end. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Henriette, for this fantastic overview. And I just want to remind everybody that you can write questions in the Q&A, and we will get to them at the end of the panel. Our next speaker is Orit Vaknin-Yakutieli, who is a researcher of modern Morocco and a lecturer at the Department of Middle Eastern Studies at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. She is the chair of the Chaim Herzog Center for Middle East Studies and Diplomacy and the chair of the Ben-Gurion Fund for the Research of North African Jewry. She is a co-founder of My Heart is in the West, Bladna, and the Forum for the Study of Jews and Christians in Muslim Cultures. Her research deals with colonialism, Kaidalism, labor history, and the Vichy period in Morocco. Orit also writes on the history of Moroccan Jewry and the historiography about them in Morocco and in its diasporas, touching upon issues of memory, cultural production, and the relevance of these to intergroup and interreligious relationships. And her talk today is titled Jewish Women in Intercommunal Political Movements in Colonial Morocco. I turn it over to you, Orit.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are. I'm very grateful to Maayan, David, and Shir, and the rest of the organizer for making me a part of this exciting and diverse series. I would like to share Thank you. Mrs. Sultan has described the struggle of women all over the world in recent years, not only for their rights but also for peace, while emphasizing the horrors of war which the imperialist forces seek to free from their shackles. Mrs. Sultan referred to in this 1950s French intelligence report was a Jewish lawyer from Casablanca, the president of the Union des Femmes Marocaines, Moroccan Women's Union, hereafter referred as the UFM, an intercommunal Christian-Muslim Jewish women organization. The event in which he spoke was one of the last conventions of her union, which a short time later disintegrated as its leadership was expelled from Morocco by the French authorities. What is the history of the UFM? Why were the French so afraid of it? Why is it almost unknown in current historiography? In the next few minutes, I will focus on the UFM, which for over 10 years during the colonial period engaged in community activities for common Moroccan goals. Yet, before getting to our specific topic, a few words on the historiography of political activism of women in pre-colonial and colonial Morocco. Apparently, studies on this issue are limited, and what does exist is rather new. The first texts that refer to women histories in this period were novels or biographies, like Laila Abu Zid's The Ear of the Elephant or Fatima Merenis's Dreams of Trespass. Definite academic discussion of the subject appeared only later. As Julia Clancy Smith had remarked, women are not sufficiently represented in North African historiography because most national historiographers preferred male heroes and their deeds, as typical of many national movements all over the world. If women were studied, the discussion was often limited to places like the education system, the national movement, or brothels. Historically, the first women organizations in Morocco were Jewish. They appeared in the late 19th century in direct connection with the establishment of the Alliance Israélite Universelle schooling system, which assigned a great importance to women's education. The direct link between the creation of women's organizations and the initial exit from the private sphere to the public school is actually a part of the first feminist wave, which has occurred in many places all over the world at the same time. With the establishment of the French Protectorate in Morocco in 1912, it created educational institutions for Muslim women. However, these were few and were aimed mainly at teaching specific crafts. Muslim schools, which accepted girls as well, were established also by the local bourgeoisie, but since they charged a tuition fee, only girls from wealthy families could afford them. In the 1930s, the emerging nationalist movement demanded that all Muslim women be given a right to education. However, in the atmosphere of the anti-colonial struggles, the French administration opposed to any nationalist demand. Contrary to restrictions imposed on Moroccans, the French Christian inhabitants of the Protectorate enjoyed a relative freedom, and on the eve of World War II, their community in Morocco included a large number of civil society organizations, political parties, and some women associations. However, this political openness ended with the outbreak of World War II, when all these were banned. In less than a year, France surrendered to Germany, and soon afterwards a pro-German government was formed in Vichy. One of the first aims of this government was to purge French society of what it defined as its contaminants, Jews, communists, and Freemasons. Legislations in this spirit quickly emerged and was transferred to the French-Moroccan Protectorate as well. Jews, communists, Freemasons, and members of left-wing organizations were fired from government positions, banned from practicing certain professions, deprived of any civil rights, and in some cases even arrested. In retrospect, it seems that many of the future leaders of organizations established after the war, which I will mention later, were affected by these regulations, and this probably strengthened their political zeal. On November 1942, American forces landed in Morocco and ended Vichy rule in the country. With the gradual abolition of Vichy bans, political association was allowed in a much more liberal way than before the war, which resulted in an immediate and rapid institutionalization of multiple civil society organizations. This was the setting for the founding of the Moroccan Communist Party in 1943, followed a few months later by the establishment of the Moroccan Nationalist Party, the Istiqlal. The political openness also encouraged the funding of women's organizations. The most active among them was the UFM, which was founded in 1944 as an affiliate of the Communist Party. Its founders were European and a number of Jewish Moroccan women, the most prominent of whom were Fortunée Sultan and Freha Ayash. The founding event of the UFM was a large and festive gathering held in May 1944 at the Vox Cinema in Fez in front of 400 participants and representatives of other left-wing groups. The keynote speaker, Mrs. Bernardini, served the role of women in the liberation of France and presented a broad historical overview of the situation of women's rights in Europe. She praised the equality won by the women in Russia, acclaimed the guaranteeing of suffrage to women in Norway, Sweden, the United States, and England, and concluded that, as always, France lags behind. A few months later, the UFM elected its executive committee, which included 10 European women and 2 Jewish Moroccan women. The UFM had branches in many Moroccan cities, of which the busiest was Casablanca. In November 1944, it organized housewives' demonstrations against the cost of living, led by Fareha Ayash. A year later, responding to a food shortage in Morocco, Ayash promoted a project of foodstuff distribution through the UFM centers. The members helped poor street children and organized holiday events in needy areas for Jews and Muslims, Erev Rosh Hashanah, Purim, and Eid al-Kabir. The union also organized joint summer camps for Muslim, Jewish, and Christian children. Hence, Jewish members of the UFM promoted both Jewish goals and common ones, with the aim of creating shared environment for all components of Moroccan society. In 1945, the UFM also launched a journal called Femmes du Maroc, through which it reported its activities and disseminated its ideas. Simultaneously, also Muslim women began to establish their own organizations. In 1946, the Istiqlal founded a women's association, and soon after, the second largest Moroccan party, Hizb al-Shura wal-Istiqlal, established its own women organization, Akhwat al-Safa, the Sisters of Purity. The main goal of these bodies was a struggle for independence. According to historian Aisha Belarbi, the national movement, which in her words was dominated by patriarchal and sexist ideology, used these women unions as backing agents for spreading nationalist ideology and for supporting orphans and widows of martyrs killed in anti-colonial demonstrations. To sum up this stage, from 1943 to 1947, in Morocco, as around the world at that time, women took part in political activism mainly through welfare activities. Welfare was considered a legitimate female activity that did not threaten the gender division of roles. When women engaged in education, heirs, children, and the needy, they played domestic and feminine roles. Only at the second stage, which I will now survey, women started to leave this allocated place and turned to broader political matters. In 1947, the Moroccan struggle for independence intensified and culminated with the Sultan Muhammad V's Tangier speech, in which he called for Moroccan independence. Princess Lala Aisha, who accompanied her father on his trip to Tangier, delivered a speech after him, which, in addition to national issues, also demanded the liberation of Moroccan women. Both the content of the speech, that was broadcasted all over Morocco, and the fact that she delivered it without veil, made the event symbolic turning point in female activism in Morocco. But this was not a first public appearance in that matter that month. A few days before the historic speech, Lala Aisha appeared in front of a UFM meeting in Fez. She addressed the audience in Arabic. Most of the time, the speech were given in French, and called on all women to fight economic inequality and work together to achieve a true democracy in Morocco. This event, as well as the broader changes in the political atmosphere, marked a turning point at the UFM, which now emphasized Moroccan domestic affairs. The change was immediately reflected in the composition of the new board of directors elected in 1947. It now included 9 Muslim, 7 European, and 6 Jewish women, included Fortunée Sultan Fareha Ayash and Evelyn Sarfati, Abraham Sarfati's sister. That is, a Moroccan majority was formed in the board. Furthermore, Fortunée Sultan was elected as the new president of the union. Sultan's entire dedication to the UFM at the time is remarkable. 2 years earlier, as the war in Europe was coming to an end, her spouse, Léon Sultan, had volunteered to the Free French Army. Shortly after enlisting, he was killed. While recovering from her loss, Fortunée Sultan stepped up her activity at the UFM, devoting most of her time to its goals. Thanks to her specialization as a lawyer, Sultan took personal care of many cases in which the civil rights of women were violated by the colonial administration. Beginning in 1947, a major task that the UFM undertook was the act against rising commodity prices. It sent a list of demands to the Resident General and distributed leaflets in Casablancan market calling all women, European and Moroccan alike, to attend weekly protest meeting in 5 places in the city. In a major conference discussing the situation, the assembly decided to set up a committee made of Muslim and Jewish representatives to decide what was the best way to deal with the current problems. In addition, the union organized a large demonstration in the streets of Casablanca. In the early 1950s, there was a dramatic increase in the tensions between the French and the Moroccans. As part of the subsequent suppression, national and communist leaders were arrested or deported from Morocco. Among them was Freha Ayash. However, despite the turbulent conditions, the union continued its activities. At a gala event to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the Fédération Internationale des Femmes, Fortunée Sultan declared that women's struggle had recently expanded. Referring to the Cold War, she said that now, beyond women's rights, their fight should also be for peace and against the new war instigated by the imperialist oppressors. In 1952, the demonstrations intensified in the so-called Casablanca riots, in which hundreds of Moroccans were killed. In response, French security forces raided poor urban areas, arresting or deporting hundreds of activists, including the entire leaderships of the national, syndicalist, and communist movements. Among the deportees were many of the UFM leaders and their spouses who were also political activists. The expulsion of the UFM leadership put an end to this women's union. In summary, let me propose a few observations and conclusions. The first is historiographical. Apparently, in contrast to cases of expulsion of male political leaders, many women leaders became historiographically transparent after their expulsion. In our case, a lot was written about the husbands of Freha Ayash and Fortunée Sultan, Germaine and Léon, and about the brother of Eveline Sarfati, Abraham, but the 3 of these women activists were almost totally absent from historiography. Resembling other national narratives, and as shown by numerous researchers, often after achieving the goal of the national struggle, women were excluded from the narrative. This reflects gender and power relationships, first at the time of the struggle itself, second in the context of creating foundational narratives of the new nation-state, and third among researchers of nationalism. All this created a situation in which access to knowledge about women is limited, and this in turn impaired their inclusion within the story. A relatively rare exception to this rule occurred recently in Morocco. In 2013, as part of the celebrations of the 70th anniversary of Moroccan Communist Party, now called Hizb al-Taqadum wal-Ishtirakiyya, the memory of the party's founders, including Freha Ayash and Fortunée Sultan, was honored in an online publication. In addition, the party's current women's movement dedicated its 2015 annual meeting to the memory of Freha Ayash. On both occasions, the commemorations focused on the Jewish and Muslim members, avoiding the Europeans. The matter might be linked with the current growing preoccupation in Morocco with its Jewish past in general, and with Moroccan Jews who displayed a special patriotism in particular. Another point, a basic precondition for membership in an inter-community organization in colonial Morocco was departure from the comfort zone of the mother community. Leaving the comfort zone, which is always difficult, was especially challenging under the colonial situation. In these circumstances, the creation of an intercommunal activity necessitated cooperation between colonized Muslim and Jewish women and colonizer Europeans. This cooperation could have occurred only after rapprochement had been reached between individuals in these seemingly incompatible groups. One main reason for this, I propose, is the fact that large groups, Jews, communists, Freemasons, and leftists, were purged and discriminated by the Vichy regime. I suggest that immediately after the war, shared pariah experience of Muslim Jews and Christians who were part in the groups that were purged became an important factor in forming intercommunal movements, like the UFM. Alma Heckman, in an extraordinary book about Jews in the Moroccan Communist Party, points towards similar processes. Finally, paradoxically, despite the French discriminatory colonial policies, it was precisely the colonial situation that unwillingly promoted the creation of intercommunal bodies. Hence, it seems that despite the tendency of the national and post-colonial discourses to criticize anything achieved through colonialism, they sometimes overlook colonial products like the UFM. The UFM as colonial, anti-colonial experience became an important part in the national, social and political history of Morocco. Other colonial, anti-colonial activities appeared as well in the economic sphere at that period, embodied in Vichy's corporatist project. The political framework which was objected was also the framework for the creation of global commitment to struggle. Thus, the same imperial colonial globalization was part of creating global anti-colonial action and thought. To sum up, Jewish women within the colonial modernity context in Morocco created for themselves a political, cultural, ideological, and mundane place where they can belong simultaneously to their homeland, their community, and their universal values. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this really unknown history. Our third and final speaker is Hiba Nabil Iskandarini, who is a PhD researcher in planning at the School of the Built Environment at Birmingham City University. Her research focus is on the post-conflict reconstruction of the Middle East, specifically housing projects for the purpose of fixing slums and unsanitary camps that the displaced populations are forced to live in. She earned her master's degree in architecture from the American University in Dubai and currently is residing between Dubai and Birmingham. Her talk today is titled "In Journey for an Identity, When a Palestinian Refugee Discovered She is a Sephardic Jew." And I hand it over to you, Hiba.
Hi, thank you for having me. Let me just share my screen. Okay. So it's pretty much a search for identity. I've been deprived of let's say, passport and identity all my life, because I was, my grandfather was a Palestinian refugee who resided in Lebanon in 1948, and it's a hereditary, I think, what's a status that's been sent off gradually to every generation after generation. I was born in Dubai, but I was deprived of the Emirati citizenship. My dad was deprived of the Lebanese citizenship, given the conflict and ongoing conflicts, let's say, that's been going on for the past 70 years. So I wanted to take matters into my own hand, and I wanted to find a solution to break this cycle. And the fact that I didn't have anything to hold on to. So I started searching my family origins, and I was considered stateless. My dad was considered stateless, all because of bureaucracy happening in that region. My dad wanted out of these slums, the Sabra in Shatila. He was born in Sabra in Shatila, and he gave me a better life. Thank you to my father who moved me to Dubai, and et cetera, et cetera. So it all started with doing a basic Google search about my family origins, and I just searched Skandarani and Jerbi, and then suddenly something popped out on the internet, and it says that find your Sephardic Jewish origin. Let's be honest, in the Middle East, the Arab countries, you could not hear anything about Judaism or Jewish people or Israel. This is technically banned, I think, up until 4 years ago, let's be honest, because of the peace deals. So I never knew what Sephardic Jewish was. All I know, we don't know much, let's be honest, we're oblivious. So I started searching into that, and then I began learning more about it. And then the Spanish government went online. The Spanish government was like, whoever could prove their Sephardic origins could actually obtain a citizenship. And I was like, might as well, that's a solution. So I went to my father, who's like a proper, not proper Palestinian. He never talked religion, he never talked politics, but I was like, Dad, you might be of Jewish origin. And then he didn't really agree with it. He was like, no way, I'm Palestinian. What are you saying? We were exiled because of the Jewish people, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, let's make a bet and do a DNA test. And based on the DNA test, either I win or you'll win, and then we'll just close that subject completely. So we did a DNA test, and after that, okay, the DNA test was not a factual documentation, let's be honest, but it was more of a bet between me and my father. So we did that DNA test, and it came out as his basically zero Middle Eastern per se, and it says he is 48% Iberian Peninsula, and then the rest is actually North Africa. So, and it was the second, his haplogroup was the second most prominent Jewish bloodline. So I went to him and I was like, Dad, now can you support me in this quest? And he was like, honestly, yes. Because think of him, a human who's been stateless for all his life. Now he's 67. He was like, you know what? I'd want to give off a citizenship to my family, given the fact the corrupt situation we're in, whether Lebanon or Israel or Dubai, it's all corrupt, let's be honest. So I started looking into it, and then I started gathering documentation and went to Beirut and started talking to the elders of the family, and I started building off a family tree. And then prominent Jewish names were all my great uncles, from Reuben to Jacob to, I don't know if you could see it, it's a bit blurry here. Reuben, Jacob, Job, Zachary, etc. And it's quite shocking to find a Palestinian person living in Sabra has an uncle called Reuben and an uncle called Abraham and an uncle. He's like, we had zero Muslim names. The Muslim's name came later on. So I started building up that family tree, and I contacted the lawyer. And the lawyer was like, that's not enough. We need documentation. So as I was building that up, I contacted a researcher, genealogist, and then I told them, I sent him the family tree. And then as I was doing that, Jerbi popped out, and then we started looking into Jerbi. That's my great grandmother, who's the mother of Ahmed Skandarani, who was my grandfather, who's Palestinian per se. And then it came out that, according to research and according to ongoing communication with a lot of people, apparently she was from Tunisia, from Jerba, and then she migrated to Jaffa with her father. And then my grandfather too, or his Skandarani, he was Egyptian, originally from Egypt, from Alexandria, from the Jewish quarter. And then he migrated to Jaffa because they were merchants. And then they married there, and they probably converted throughout the Ottoman Empire. I don't know where to be exact. And then that happened, and then I started building up stuff together, and I started contacting my elders. And then apparently during Passover, my great grandmother used to hand out eggs. And then she goes that, and they used to ask her, why would you do that? And then she goes like, we used to do that because it was a tradition in Tunisia. So clearly they kept their Jewish identity within them, and they were oblivious because it was a secret per se. And then it was given on gradually. And the names still today are still prominent, whether Reuben or Jacob or Job or Zachary. So that happened. And then I hired a genealogist, and a genealogist helped me he created a huge research based on facts, and he traveled to Madrid, and then he started gathering up information. And then when he gathered up the information, our Skanderani bloodline was actually a Nahmanid. And from that, we were connected to Cap de Porta. And we are the son of, and my great-great-great-grandfather was Astric of Skanderani. And that's how we became, that was my link. And then I started gathering up more documentation, and I found a marriage certificate for Maryam al-Jirbi, it's a Jewish marriage certificate. And then we applied for Jewish federations in Spain and Portugal to prove our Jewish identity with documentation. And funny enough, it was all approved. And I went to Spain, and I went to Barcelona specifically, where our origin was. And I started looking into the streets, and I felt like I was at home. And it was beautiful. And then after that, I posted something on Facebook, and I was like, it was a nice speech on Facebook about how we're all one. And then I found out I'm a Palestinian of Jewish origin, etc. So I started getting a lot of notification and information from people contacting me. And there's just one person on my father's the one in the center. He's the one with the glasses. Oh, well, they're both with the glasses. The person on the left contacted me, and he goes like, we have the same migration route, and I believe we're related. So now we're in contact together. And then another person told on the right, I kind of hid everyone's name because I don't have, oh yeah. And they started contacting me, and the resemblance is quite insane. And then when we had a Skype meeting with them, as you can see on the right, they told me that I look like their daughter. And when she sent me a picture and I contacted her, she's literally a replica of me. And it's quite shocking, to be honest, this journey that I went through. And then finally, after 26 years of being deprived of a citizenship or a passport or an identity, the Spanish government took me into open arms and gave me a citizenship. And it was quite beautiful, to be honest. And yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening.
Oh, thank you so much, Hiba. We are going to turn to the Q&A section of the event right now. So if you have any questions, please write them down in the Q&A tab, and I will channel them to the panelists. So while we are gathering questions, I would like to present one myself, if I may. And this is a perhaps unfair one, but I do want to ask about the events of the past few weeks and the eruption of violence and violent clashes that we saw in so-called mixed cities in Israel and in East Jerusalem. And I was wondering how the kind of history and personal experience that we've heard in these talks today help us think about this violence and help us understand it, help us read this, whether it's from the perspective of Mizrahi and Ashkenazi history of relationships that Henriette spoke about, or histories of intercommunal and collaborative activism that is happening, perhaps ironically, under colonialist conditions that Orit was mentioning, or this very surprising, astounding, unknown history of exchange and the almost fluidity of identities, or the historical ironies of identity that Hiba was talking about. So I was wondering if anybody wants to begin with some insights about the really shocking news that we've seen in the past few weeks.
Well, would you like me to refer to your question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think it goes straight from my conclusion of the relationship between Mizrahim and Arabs in Israel. As I said, the state did everything to divide and rule, but at the same time discriminated with various methods the Palestinians, the citizens of Israel, and the Mizrahim. So both of these populations, the majority of these populations, were pushed to the margins of the weak cities, to the socio-economic low level, to the periphery. Naturally, these were also the points where the Mizrahim and the Arabs, the Palestinians, get together as weak societies, as weak populations. The upper class, for example, live in exclusive Jewish upper class neighborhood in the center of Tel Aviv, in Haifa, in Beersheba, you name it. So whenever there is tension, the most bounded populations to enter into conflict and to actually to face the tension is where the Mizrahi lower class and the Palestinian, of course, lower class meet each other, and they meet each other on the level of tension, because the tension is always there. Although people in general have the force and the will to continue living, the tension is there. And once the tension is enhanced, the conflict bursts out. And this is how I understand happened, that if there was no research done, but I can safely assume that the majority of Jews were of Mizrahi origin, and of course the Palestinians were the Palestinians of lower class. So this is a problem that the state and the authorities of the state do not really face in a real, true effort to reduce the tension.
I can try to answer the question or to relate to the current events from an historical perspective of Morocco. That was my topic, or from colonial studies. So the context of all of this that we should keep in mind is occupation. So it's a colonial situation. This is the framework where these things happened. So it wasn't a surprise, though there are always immediate reasons for something like this to happen. There is this volume of violence in both leadership that it is so intense in the last year, especially the changes, especially in the Israel political, the government, the state, and the society. So racism really raised and became very common. Racist expression became normal expression. There is no resistance for any kind of such a behavior of politicians or people in the society. And from another colonial studies perspective is the way in which in the last decades the identity, the culture of the Mizrahi Jews was de-Arabized. So there is an historical background to the support of the Mizrahi, the right wing's support of the Mizrahi, but in the last decades, it became really a question of opposing groups. And I want also to mention that the violence and the discourse are not exclusively of Mizrahi Jews. In many cases, the leadership of extreme right-wing parties in Israel are Ashkenazi and not Mizrahi. And sometimes so there is the groups of people and the participants on grassroots organization of many Mizrahi, but not exclusively. And what we can take from the experience in Morocco is that in colonial situation, in order of group to create intercommunal organization, there should be a basic condition where people feel belonging to a certain homeland or a certain place, which is absent in the case of Israel. Thank you.
I think it's a deep-rooted narrative that has been implemented within us for the past 100 years between both sides. If we're talking about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I don't know much about the Sephardic Mizrahi, etc. But in my opinion, because of that narrative, which is divide and conquer as well, that's caused more divisions between those two sides, so that one powerful entity could atop the other. But if you look at the regions, whether Syria, Lebanon, whether Palestinian territories, Dubai, etc., 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 there's a lot of mixed, how do I say it, like the concept of Arabizing the world. Like you see a person whose mother's Syrian and the father's Palestinian and the other grandfather's Lebanese, but it's the concept of the narrative that has been given to us to despise the Israeli idea of taking over the country. But if you look at it in a deeper perspective, in a much, not deep, historical perspective, they're all from, the mass majority of the population is somehow from Arabic region. But I think it's how the media played it, how the public played it for us to create hate among the Mizrahi Jews and the Sephardic Jews, because they don't know. We don't know anything. The Arab region does not know and wouldn't want to tap into that. It was just concept of hate them, they took over. But then again, a large number were actually of Arab countries with a Jewish religion. You know what I mean? So why would I accept a Syrian country marrying into a Lebanese, and it's normal because we're from the Levant, but we don't accept Israel, who are actually mass majorities Arab. So I think there just needs to be a change of narrative in the understanding of the Israeli identity as a whole to the public of the Middle East. And I think then we know how to move forward and stop this ongoing conflict, because I think we're all somehow the same. In my opinion, we're all mixed race from that area, ongoing. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think what all of your talks really demonstrate is how history can help dislodge some, concepts that have been completely naturalized and are a mode of actively changing reality as well. We have several people with a question to Hiba, and I'm just going to group them together. So several people have asked, how do you define yourself and your identity today, having found out about this family history? What has been the response to this discovery from Palestinian friends and family? And a similar question from Dalia Kandiuti, who is together with Professor Lina Ben Mayor, has been collecting oral histories of applicants to Spanish and Portuguese citizenship and are editing a volume of this on this topic. And one of the questions that they ask their interviewees is, how does this knowledge impact your current identity? Yeah, love to hear your thoughts about that.
Well, to be honest, if I want to say, I never had an identity. So today being Spanish does not change what I was deprived of. This is just something, I cannot say I'm Spanish, let's be honest. I don't know as much as I read into the culture and know about that culture, I don't know nothing. It was just a safety net to help me pursue my freedom as a human, because I was deprived off of it from everyone. I wasn't only deprived off of it from Israel, I was deprived of it from every country. As for my family, they took it into open arms, and it made them like, you know, when it's a cartoon and you see a light bulb. When I started putting pictures together in small fragments of the situation, I'm like, yeah, it's possible. It's not even possible. It's legit. We are actually of Jewish origin, because things started being put together. And my friends as well actually got jealous, because they go like, how can you be a Spanish now and I'm deprived of my rights in Lebanon or Jordan or etc. If you want to ask me what do I identify as, I still go like, I used to, I used to sing it a lot. Like, to be honest, I came to the UK to study, and then every time they ask me where you're from, and I go like, half Palestinian, half Lebanese, born and raised in Dubai. And then they ask me, what passport do you hold? And I was like, nothing. I hold stateless document that says, yo, I could just have a pass on that document. And then now I just added that to the narrative with the song, let's be honest, half Palestinian, half, because that's what I know. Palestinian, Lebanese, born and raised in Dubai, became Spanish a year ago. Why did you become Spanish a year ago? Of Jewish origin. And then everyone just shocked in front of me. So to be honest, if you want to ask me what am I go like I'm a child of Abraham, to be completely honest. And I'm from the Levant. Let me just say Levant to make it more broad. But yeah, that's my context. And what's the second question?
The questions were about how you think of your identity. And
I look at it. I look at religion in my perspective, because I'm more spiritual. Even as before finding out my Jewish origin, I was very spiritual with my oneness with God, and that's what I connected all three religions, to be honest. And that's when I say, if I can make, I'm not saying I'm going to make a new religion, but I'm a child of Abraham, because we're all descendants of that person, and these three religions are Abrahamic religions, intersected, interrelated in some way or form. So yeah.
Thank you. I have another question from Mayan to Henriette. And actually, I was wondering about that too. One thing you mentioned in your talk is that there was an activist from Berkeley, California, organizing with the Black Panthers in Jerusalem, which is, I have never heard about that. And the question is there a similarity, or what are the connections between the Mizrahi struggle in Israel and, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States? And what do these connections that are made, at least in slogans, what do they help us learn or understand about these protest movements?
Well, if I had time, I would open up the historical context in order to explain how many experiences, political experiences that go on in the Western world, especially in the United States, are imported to Israel. Now, just to make a very, very short story of a very, very long story, in '68, in Europe and the United States, there was this movement of the New Left, of the struggle against Vietnam War, of the hippie, make love not war, etc., and so forth. This protest that wanted to bring a new world, a new equal world, to bring love, to put an end to wars, etc., and so forth. It took about 5 years, from '68, '67 to '71, to make Aliyah to Israel. Now, the reason was because in 67, there was the 67 war. The 67 war was a great victory that surprised Israel, overcoming the threat of all Arab countries. However, many Jews have been moved emotionally and decided to make Aliyah. One of them, or I think a handful of them, were feminists from Berkeley, California, intellectuals from New York University, and they came to Israel. And one of them was Naomi Kiss. Now, Naomi Kiss came to Jerusalem, and she faced the discrimination, and she saw a very severe picture of inequality within Israel, and could perceive and identify the discrimination against people who are not Ashkenazi, who are not from the Western world. And many of them were actually from Morocco. That is not only Mizrahim, but the majority of Moroccan Jews who came from Morocco in 48, 49, etc. The point was that when the youngsters, the second generation, I mentioned Wadi Salib in 59, but 71 was the second generation. And the second generation had the traumatic collective memory from the demonstrations which were oppressed in 59. In 71, it was the young people, both who actually had an alliance between the student activists from the Hebrew University and the Mizrahim from Musrara. They used to sit in Bohemian Cafe. It was called two Bohemian Cafe called Ta'amon and the tea house, the yellow tea house. And they exchange opinions. The Mizrahim youngsters were poor, deprived, discriminated, but they were not stupid. And they started to accumulate the ideas of the new left. And they put together their forces in order to form this movement. And Nomiki suggested that we're talking about Black Panthers in the Israeli version. So they call themselves Black Panthers. It was her idea, and they ended up demonstrating together in the movement of the Black Panthers. I think, I think this is it. This is how it explains why they call themselves Black Panthers, and they took the ideology, they put it into the demonstrations. And again, it was a collective memory that was, that wrote actually a traumatic page of history within the social history of Israel, of the Mizrahim. I want to address the question regarding the BLM, the Black Lives Matter. Well, the studies I did ever since had many similarities, but at the same time, they were different. That is, the similarities are of deprivation, looking from up down on the Mizrahim as inferior, disadvantaged, primitive, who came from non-Western societies. And I think I don't have to expand too much because the word Orientalist or Orientalism enveloped all these attitudes of the authorities, both in the Western world and in Israel. But there is also the difference between them, because we are talking about part of like the idea of unifying the nation, putting all together the Jewish from the diaspora, melting the pot, having one force against other people who are the enemies, etc., and so forth. So I think when we look at the BLM, we look about racism that is also involved skin color. Whereas with the Mizrahim, we're talking about people who are diverse. That is, some of them, yes, have darker skin. Some of them look like Western people, and this allows political gain. That is, those who don't look. I have this article that's called "You're so pretty, you don't look Moroccan," and when you don't look Moroccan, you can play the role of like moving from the Mizrahi to the Ashkenazi domain in order to make your way in the life, your life way within Israel. So I think when we say BLM, we have to be cautious in the comparison.
Yeah, and I think the examples you bring up really illustrate how we have to think about class, not just race or ethnicity, when we speak about Mizrahi Ashkenazi relations in Israel as well. We have time for one final question. So I have just one question for Orit, who it was very interesting to hear Henriette speaking now about how political ideas and movement migrate from different contexts and take shape in new or have to change in new colonial or non-metropolitan contexts. And you talked a little bit about tensions between the nationalist movement and feminist ideologies. I was wondering if there were any tensions that have to do with feminist analysis, gender analysis within the communist groups that you were talking about as well. And just a little bit more broadly, the tensions that arise between feminist activism and these, what you call broader political movements within the Moroccan context.
Thank you for the question. I think that we should think about this colonial situation as modern colonial modernity, where ideas of feminism, innovations, changing in class system, and nationalism came together. And sometimes they competed each other, and it was a very masculine world. So it wasn't that it was accepted that women were part and parcel of everything that was going on, but it was accepted that promoting women's status is important for building the state. So it was a discourse going on since in the Middle East since the end of the 19th century. But it wasn't translated into practical political practices. It wasn't, or not as much as it was discussed in theoretical discussions. So this modern society was a very masculine one, but at the same time, women and not feminism, but women's status, women's role in the building of the state was very much in the heart of the discussion. So women became symbol. And we don't have to go so far to history to see how women issues are becoming symbols and part of discussion, while in the practices of everyday life, even in the academia, the language, the thinking is still very, very masculine. So going back 50 years ago, it's really hard to reflect on the way we perceive feminism today, on the way people perceive the role of women in the society. So it's also even in the question of documentation. When I started these studies, even today I don't know, for example, when Freya Hayash passed away, because there is not almost nothing about them, about those women. And most of them, even in their life, were excluded from political activities and remain in the smaller organizations. So this is very similar to our world, not just to Morocco.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I would love to keep asking you questions, all of you, but we are running out of time. So I want to thank everybody who asked questions in the audience. I want to thank you for your talks, informative talks, and very thoughtful engagement with the questions that were raised here and with each other's ideas. And I will hand it off now to Maayan, who will say some words about the closing event of the series and conclude this event. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Shir, Henriette, Orit, and Hiba for your fascinating and really thought-provoking talk and discussions. I really enjoyed it. I just want to remind our audience that the next event will be the closing event of our series on Arab-Jewish culture, identity, and language. And it will feature Ziv Yechezkel, an acclaimed religious Israeli singer and composer who speaks, writes, and sings in Arabic and Hebrew. Yechezkel renews and performs sublime rendition of the classics of Arabic music and collaborates with singers from the Arab world to promote religious tolerance between Muslims and Jews. So in this event, Ziv Yechezkel will sing live and share with us his unique story and musical journey, as well as his experience with fans and musicians from the Arab world as an Israeli Mizrahi singer. So the event will take place exactly 2 weeks from today, so Sunday, June 13 at 11 a.m. in Chicago time. I'm really looking forward to it and very much hope to see you all there. Here in the chat, you can find the link for registration. And have a great rest of the day, wherever you are. Thank you so much.